So the philosophy of touch begins really with the struggle between Plato and Aristotle. Plato argues that touch is the lowest of the senses and that sight, the eye, is the highest of the senses. And indeed his definition in the Cratylus of the human is the one who stands erect and who looks upwards. Anthropos, the one who looks upwards. In other words, who evolves beyond or moves beyond his existence or her existence with the quadrupeds, the animal order, and has access to a unique human intellectual order, which reaches its summit with the divine vision, that is to say, looking upwards towards the divine form of the good, the divine idea of the good. And of course, idea itself has a visual connotation, as does eidos, the essence of things. Now, you can't literally see the form of the good. It remains invisible. But sight is that sense of all of our five senses which leads us beyond our tangible tactile existence or coexistence with the animal material world and guides us towards transcendence, towards the spiritual, which means for Plato, and subsequently right up to Descartes, a certain disincarnation, or what I call excarnation. Now, Aristotle, coming after Plato, as we all know, his disciple, corrects him in this regard in the De Anima, the first work of human psychology and philosophy of the senses, where he argues in chapter 11 that in fact it's touch that is the highest sense, not sight, but touch. And he says that touch is the most universal and most philosophical of our senses because it is that sense which makes us most vulnerable, most exposed to otherness, to the world, to experience. The most unthinking and quote-unquote stupid of creatures, for Aristotle, maybe he's a bit unfair, is the oyster, because the oyster does not feel. The oyster is encrusted. It is immobile. It does not move. It does not desire. It does not, as Shakespeare would say, expose itself to feel what wretches feel. So enclosed in itself, it does not register any fundamental relationship of challenge or risk or adventure in the world, as humans do, because they are wrapped around with an organ called skin. And the medium of that skin is flesh, what Aristotle calls sarx, and the sense of flesh is touch. But touch does not have an immediate relationship to things. It's already a mediation of things. He calls it a metaxo. Because touch, he says, is already interpreting things as hot or cold, hospitable or inhospitable, good or bad, edible or inedible, this or that. In other words, it's already, as he puts it, a form of interpretation. It's already a kind of a proto-hermeneutic. Touch knows differences is one of his famous phrases. Touch knows differences. And so it puts itself, the human, as a tangible, tactile being exposed to others, constantly mediating one's experiences with others through the skin. In French, it's exposition. Jean-Luc Nancy has a nice phrase, expo, and P-E-A-U, skin. It's our fundamental form of exposure. And we are born naked and we die naked. Naked came I into the world, naked shall I depart. That's from Job, I think, but Aristotle could have said the same thing. And so it is our most universal sense because it traverses all of the other senses. In other words, it is the fact that we have tactful odor that we can have flair. It is because we can have tactful sight that we can have insight. It is because we have tactful hearing that we can have resonance. So all of the senses, including taste, tactful taste is savvy or sapientia, as we say, for someone to have savvy, is to be able to taste the world in a meaningful way. And for Aristotle, it's very important that all of our senses be traversed by touch and therefore be tactile and tangible, because what is the unique feature of touch that is universal to all human beings? It is a reciprocal relationship with the world, because when you touch something, you are tactile and tangible at the same time. When the hand touches the hand, the famous phenomenological example that Husserl is going to take up in the 20th century and Merleau-Ponty after him, and Rigore and others, when the hand touches the hand, you have the experience both of active touching and passive being touched. And because we are creatures who are wrapped around with skin, because we are incarnate creatures, not excarnate as Platonism believed. Plato is a complex character, as we know. He said many things, but Platonism, in terms of its dualism between the tactile body versus the optical and intellectual soul, for Aristotle, this reciprocal relationship of touching and being touched, which is the proper domain of the tactile, renders us always responsible for others and for ourselves. We're constantly in a recursive, reciprocal, mutual, dialogical relationship with others from the word go. That's why it's also philosophical, because we put ourselves into question when we no longer are sure of who or what we are. We risk existence by being reciprocally related to others. And this goes right down to simple things, as Aristotle says in the Ethics, for instance, of having savvy, flair, taste, resonance in the way we even share food with people. He makes a distinction between the gourmet and the gourmand. The gourmand is the one who engages in gluttony and simply takes in food, imbibes, but doesn't appreciate or give thanks for the food, doesn't ask where does the food come from, doesn't ask about the flavors and savors of the food. And he compares it also to a wine taster. The ethical person is somebody who savors and appreciates differences, particularities, singularities. And that begins with how we drink wine and water or how we eat food. Levi-Strauss says, of course, human civilization goes back to the distinction between the edible and the inedible, what we eat and what we don't eat. Well, again, that's a question of tactful taste. So all of our senses, all five, are synesthetically interwoven based on the traversal of all the senses by touch. That's why it is, for Aristotle, the most universal and the most philosophical. So this debate between Plato and Aristotle actually is subsequently played out during 2,000 years of history, where for the most part, Plato's Anthropocene, if I can put it like that, his anthropological notion of the privileging of sight, anthropos is the one who looks up and looks away from the tactile incarnate body, ultimately won out. There were always exceptions. For example, the mystics, you'll find, always talk about experiencing the ultimate through the flesh, through the body, through desire. Which seems like a paradox, but it's extraordinary in the writings of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and so on. They're aware that they are incarnate beings, that even the ultimate and most fundamental relationship to the highest good, to God, is through the tangible, tactile, incarnate body. And they're not unaware of the fact as Christian mystics, there are of course Jewish and Islamic mystics too, but as Christian mystics, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, were very aware that Christ was the Word made flesh, Logos made sarx, and that body, that enfleshed body, that incarnate body, not the excarnate spirit and soul of a Platonic dualism, is what fundamentally carries the message of redeeming the world and being open to suffering people, to others, all different kinds of others. Again, as Aristotle said, touch knows differences. But in the tradition of Western metaphysics, which is often called the Anthropocene, there is a sense that our sight, optocentrism therefore, the optical, dominates the other senses. And one of the reasons for this is that it gives us a command over and a control over nature. Therefore, Descartes famously or infamously says, we are the masters and possessors of nature because we possess the cogito, which is pure seeing. And this leads with Hobbes and Bentham to the idea of the panopticon, the all-seeing eye, right down to Tolkien's notion in The Lord of the Rings of Sauron, the all-seeing eye. The panopticon, as you may know, which features so dramatically and prominently in Foucault's book on surveillance and punishment, is a way of controlling and commanding the world and bodies through this anthropocentric, optocentric eye. So what we have in contemporary philosophy is a debate, particularly in phenomenology, but also in cognitive science, about the role of touch and how it can be retrieved again from its long erasure or certainly omission, if not oblivion, in Western metaphysics. Heidegger talks about the oblivion of being and the question of being. I would talk about the oblivion of touch and the question of touch. And its possible return in what I call an age of anacarnation, where we return again to the body and discover ourselves as incarnate beings, embodied beings. And this is central to the phenomenology of Husserl, of Merleau-Ponty, as I mentioned earlier, of feminist phenomenology, of much of psychoanalytic phenomenology, that we are embodied, incarnate beings. This is particularly evident and important in our current age because it's a digital age. And the digital age means one thing, obviously, that is digital codes. But the digital can also mean one's fingers, one's digits, one's fingers and toes. In other words, hands and feet that implant us as skin in the world, as flesh in the world, and return us anacarnationally to the earth. And the sacredness of the earth, indeed, and the reciprocal relationship with the earth, which is so important for our ecological crisis at the moment, which is probably our most important moral question. Certainly that's what UNESCO discovered recently in a questionnaire that went out to young people under the age of 25 throughout the world, said that the ecological question, the survival of the planet, the climate crisis, is the most important contemporary crisis. Now, war, poverty, migration are all linked to that, but it goes back basically to this sense of concern for the earth. And one is concerned for the earth when one is in a reciprocal relationship to the earth and realizes that our relationship with trees, for example, is a question of exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. Trees breathe us in and we breathe them in. We're inhaling and exhaling in each other. And that's at a very simple level of everyday nature. We are part of nature. We are anacarnate, incarnate beings. So it's important to retain the double sense of the digital as both the virtual world of communications, of digital communications, which are indispensable. We wouldn't be communicating here and now without that medium, but also the digital as a medium of touch, of tactility, and of tact. So they're the issues that I was trying to explore in my book, Touch, Returning to Our Most Vital Sense, Recovering Our Most Vital Sense, which I wrote during the pandemic, when touch became something that we could no longer take for granted. When touch went under erasure, when we were forbidden to touch each other, social distancing and so on, and then people dying in hospitals of COVID, when relatives and family couldn't be with them and friends, they cried out for touch. And the doctors and the nurses said this: we couldn't cure them, we had no medicine for them, this was in the early days, but all we could do was take their hand and their shoulder. And there was a touch hunger that was revealed during that time that became very obvious to us. It's like the song of Joni Mitchell, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." And when touch was gone, we appreciated how important it was, even, touching handles and sharing plates and knives, and that we're touching all the time. And touch is a proximity to people. It's, for example, in-person teaching. There's a tactile, tangible element. Because, of course, pheromones and photons and the tympanum of the ear, the retina of the eye, we're being touched all the time by vibrations, by wavelengths. And it is, of course, epitomized in the paradigmatic handshake of a hand touching a hand, which is a reciprocal gesture. All civilization begins with a handshake, which is putting away the possibility of violence, reaching for your sword and exposing your bare hand to the other's bare hand, skin on skin. Rather than corps-à-corps combat, you make peace through the shaking of the hand. During COVID, there was no shaking of hands. There was no possibility of tactility in that regard, either immediate or mediated. So it became an issue for us. And we began to question, that's what I tried to do in the book, going back through the philosophy of the controversy in Plato and Aristotle, right down to contemporary phenomenology, but also asking, what does touch mean for neonatals, for children? What does it mean for people who are dying? Obviously, that was very, very dramatic during COVID. But also, what does it mean for children who are born? And there are many research investigations on this, which show that children deprived of touch in their early months suffer greatly mentally and physically for the rest of their lives. There was a famous case of the orphans in Ceausescu's Romania, who were kept in orphanages and not touched, and they were all profoundly traumatized and maimed for the rest of their lives. There were other studies done after the war in Switzerland, where there were a lot of orphans who, again, were kept in perfectly sanitary, medically, caring situations in terms of pharmaceuticals and light and warmth, but they weren't touched and deprived of touch. Again, it became evident that left huge scars. The absence of touch, the removal of touch, the deprivation of touch proved to be profoundly wounding. So in the book, I look into the possibilities of healing touch. So the healing power of touch goes back to the beginnings of nearly all wisdom traditions. It's very, very obvious in indigenous communities, but in the Western wisdom traditions, it's also paramount. For example, in the Greek tradition, Asclepius, who was one of the founding patrons of Western medicine, was somebody who cured through touch, like his mentor Chiron, who was a wounded healer. Chiron was wounded in a hunt and subsequently in a battle, but instead of responding with violence and wounding the other who had wounded him, he suffered the wound. And as a result, he became a wounded healer through touch. And he worked in caves, therefore in the earth, and he worked through plants and through water, through the elements. He used the elements. And Asclepius, who was his disciple, would cure people precisely through these tactile and tangible media. And he gave rise to a whole series of Asclepions, as they were called, scattered throughout Greece, which said that healing comes from being in touch with the earth and with other people. Asclepius used to appear to those he was healing in the form of an animal. So again, it was the animal world, the symbiotic world of relating to all sentient creatures. You find this in Buddhism and Hinduism, but it was already there also in the early Greek tradition of healing. And where Hippocrates, the other founder of Western medicine, was very much for the optocentric diagnosis, for the management of pain, for the reading of pain, for the interpretation of pain, and very important, and then surgical intervention. Asclepius worked, on the other hand, through touch. And chiron, indeed, means the one who is sure of touch, who is tender of touch. So Chiron and Asclepion became the patron saints of one form of medicine, which was healing through reciprocal touch. What today we would call, or traditionally we would call, the bedside manner, being with the person. While on the other hand, the Hippocratic was management, control, and command when it came to pain. Now, I think we'd all admit in a hospital today, or any medical practice, we need both the Hippocratic and the Asclepian. But the Asclepian was an essential part of this. And as I say, it was based on a symbiotic relationship with the patient and with nature and with the animal order. In the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, on the other hand, the Abrahamic tradition, you find touch is also extremely important. Jacob wrestles with God and is wounded at the hip and limps ever after, but there is a healing in that loving combat. And next day he can go forth, cross the river, and be reconciled with his brother Isaac. In the Christian tradition, then we find Jesus healing again and again through touch. Even the famous and beautiful passage where he heals the woman who is hemorrhaging. It is curiously the woman who touches the hem of his garment, and then Jesus feels the power emptying from him, and he looks around and he sees that he has been touched. And in being touched, he in turn touches, and she is healed. So it's something that occurs, as it were, ecologically, carnally, naturally, as a touching and being touched. And there is practically no scene of healing in the New Testament that doesn't involve touching of some kind or the sharing of food. So when it comes to contemporary therapies of touch, we find that there is an important sort of debate going on between, on the one hand, the kind of Freudian Lacanian school that's kind of hands-off, and, the person lies down and doesn't face the analyst. It's all through sound and words and signifiers, and it works up to a point. But there's a whole new counteraction to that in many regards, that whether it's initially through Jung or later through many of the somatic body therapies, and you find this in Levine and Van der Kolk and others, the body keeps the score. And if you don't attend to the body as well as the speaking soul, if you don't attend to the feeling body, there is going to be no ultimate healing. You need both. Now, maybe Freud at the end of his days kind of understood this a little bit. He began with the laying on of hands, and then he went into a more scientific, optocentric, as it were, or audio-visual method of command and control and distance from the patient. But then at the end, he had his dog Joffrey, for example, who attended to all the seances, and the dog would pick up whether the patient was anxious, the dog would sit, and if the patient was calm, the dog would lie. And Freud actually realized the dog was, with its canine flair and savvy, able to read the inner emotions, and was more attuned to the embodied anxieties and desires and fluctuations of the patient, the analysand, than he, Freud, was. That's only an anecdote, but it's interesting how in contemporary somatic therapy there is a return to the importance of the tactile, tangible relationship with the other, that is to say, the face-to-face and the hand-to-hand. Another very important area in this debate about the digital is that in our digital age, with our digital technology, what's happened to the body? Have we become excarnate beings? My former mentor in Montreal, Charles Taylor, talked about excarnation, that we live in an age of excarnation, where everything has become so virtual and digital in the sense of code, that we've lost touch with touch. We've lost touch with ourselves. We've lost touch with the world, with the earth, and by implication with other beings as embodied beings. So then the question becomes, how do we re-establish a proper balance, sort of a commons of the body, a commons of the digital that can combine both senses of communication and contact, tactful contact. And it is a curious thing that digital communication through screens, through computers, through iPhones, where we spend, many, many hours of our lives, gives us omni-contact, as it were, omni-communication with the world, where we're in touch, it seems, with everybody through the touch screen. But in fact, the paradox is that we're more and more isolated. And the increase in depression and senses of isolation and despair and even suicide rates are being linked now to the fact that so much of our existence is digitalized in the sense of technology, whereas we need to redress that imbalance and not return in some Luddite gesture to, a pre-Platonic pasture land where we're, disporting ourselves with animals and plants. No, there's no going back. But there is the possibility of moving from the Anthropocene, where sight wins out, including particularly digital sight, over touch, to a symbiocene, where there's a symbiotic relationship, not just between the optical and the tactile, but between the human and the non-human species, in kind of a new interspecies ecological collaboration. And that would be what I call the commons of the body in a new age of anacarnation. It's curious how in contemporary culture, in popular culture, so many films and novels and stories are concerned with an anxiety about excarnation and incarnation. I think of the film Her, where the character, the protagonist, falls in love with the virtual persona, a voice. I think of Ex Machina, where the scientist is producing these perfect clones. I think of Westworld, the series that is so popular with young generations. Again and again, and of course, the AI phenomenon that's so huge now, which again is being represented in our movies, in our videos, in our video games. That is really touching on a central dilemma and a critical dilemma for us today. And it is the actual digital media themselves that very often are putting themselves in question and asking, by portraying these films. I think Don John is another one, the pornographic addiction phenomenon, which is huge. The digital media are themselves reflecting upon how augmented reality through AI is potentially benefiting, but also challenging our fundamental tactile, tangible relationship to the world. So again, what we need is what I call a carnal hermeneutics that can make those kinds of distinctions, and that enables us through mind and body to become hyper attuned and aware to what's going on outside of ourselves. Because isolationism and solipsism are very often fostered by the digital technology, which gives us the impression that we are omnipresent to all things that are passing in the world, but it's all mediated through images that we consume very often in the privacy of our own screens or our own rooms or our own offices or our own souls. So what I mean by carnal hermeneutics is then the ability to, coming back to Aristotle and phenomenology, to discern differences, to be aware of the singularities and particularities of other sentient beings and creatures, human and non-human. When we are exposed through our skin, through our flesh, through our touch, to otherness. in the second sense, which was the first sense of the digital, which is our fingers and our feet. So again, it's a question of a both and, not an either or. There's no point in sort of replicating another dualism, sort of in response to Platonism and a Platonism of excarnation. There's no point in responding with another dualism of the carnal versus the virtual. It's a question of combining both senses of the digital in a carnal hermeneutics that knows differences through touch, through reciprocity, and can at the same time engage in digital technology, which puts us in contact in all kinds of ways with people at a distance, as we discovered it was so hugely important during the pandemic, when I, for one, and many of my colleagues and friends and academics would not have been able to communicate with their students, or friends with friends, or loved ones with loved ones, family and otherwise. Very often, in far-flung corners across the globe, it was through digital technology that we were able to do that. So again, it's a question of both and, not either or. Let me give an example of the both and of digital technology and digital touch. In 2009, I founded an international non-profit project called the Guestbook Project, dedicated to what I call an ethics of narrative hospitality. And using videos, therefore digital technology, we have been inviting for the last 12 years young people in divided communities throughout the world, Northern Ireland, South Africa, Asia, Middle East, Mexican-American border and so on, to come together and exchange their stories, telling their adversary, their enemy, what their own story is, listening to that of the enemy, and then creating together a third story that surmounts the difference. For example, in Jerusalem, a young Israeli and a young Arab got together, Palestinian and Israeli, and they told the story of their respective founding narratives, namely, for the Islamic tradition, in the Quran and the Hadith, Ishmael is the favorite son of Abraham. In the Torah, the Jewish tradition, indeed the Judeo-Christian tradition, Isaac is the chosen son of Abraham. And given these two different readings of what was once the same story, different interpretations, different narratives, we've had a lot of conflict, and it is nowhere more evident than in Palestine, Israel, as I speak, tragically so. And in this video, the two young people, the Jew and the Muslim, the Palestinian and the Israeli, get together and they exchange roles. And they say, what would it be like for me to be Ishmael and you to be Isaac? And they exchange their garments, their prayer shawls, their insignia, Star of David, and so on, then Chador, and they walked through the walls of Jerusalem. And they created a video, which then was posted on the site, and then was downloaded and discussed with youth groups in different parts of the world. And what I discovered there, and let me just give one more other example, in Northern Ireland, a girl from a Catholic school and a young woman from a Protestant school got together on the walls of Derry, London Derry, and they told their respective stories about how unionism, loyalism, devotion to United Kingdom, Britain, for one tradition, led to a sense of the walls are protecting us, from the benighted Catholic nationalist hordes who have to be kept in the bog side outside of the wall. And the Catholic student told her side of the story. And then they exchanged uniforms, and that's where the tactile comes in. They exchanged uniforms because 90% of education in Northern Ireland is still denominationally divided. They exchanged uniforms, blue for green, and they walked along the walls of Derry into their respective territories. And as they did so, they laughed. And they felt what it was like to be the other, to be in the other's skin, to be wearing the other's clothes. And they made a video about it. And the video was the third story, if you will, which was them going into each other's respective forbidden territories, each other's schools, acting as if they were the other during that gesture, that leap of imaginative faith, if you will, and then creating this video where they announce at the end that every child who goes to school in Northern Ireland should sit with somebody from the opposite religion. The first day at school, they should sit with somebody from the opposite religion. And they became peace ambassadors in Northern Ireland, visiting schools, showing their video, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, indeed, the whole border area. And it was about narrative hospitality, becoming hospitable to the other's narrative and the other's being. But it was very important that they walked together and exchanged uniforms as well as making the video. So it was digital in both senses, so to speak. It was the tactile and it was the virtual. And as such, it led to a certain peace movement where, again, they posted their video and it could be accessed globally by youth groups in other places and other climes. So in terms of my own work, I began with philosophies of imagination, the wake of imagination, studying the development of Western philosophies of imagination, again from Plato and Aristotle down to contemporary debates. Different kinds of images, the image as an icon, the image as an idol, the image as a photograph, the image as a filmic experience, the image as a pop parody in Andy Warhol, the image as an expressionist painting, and so on and so forth, the image as a video clip. All these different important contemporary functions of the image, because we live in a civilization of images. But in a civilization of images, the tendency can be, because we can make absence present and presence absent through images, it's kind of magical, as Sartre tells us in his wonderful book, The Imaginary, in that regard. It can turn the real into the unreal and the unreal into the real. It gives us a huge power, but it is an optical power. It's a power of vision. And as such, it needs to be complemented, I would argue, by an ethics of responsibility in terms of a tactile, tangible relationship to the other. We need the power of the image, but we also need the power of tact and contact. Because the image and imagination all too easily, and Sartre understood this perhaps better than anybody, can have a sense of power where it becomes almost solipsistic, that it can reduce everybody in the world to a prop or an actor or a scene in its own theatre, its own theatre of the mind. Whereas touch always brings us out again into the outside world. The inside becomes the outside in touch. And we should see the image, how shall I put it? The image and the flesh, the image becoming flesh and the flesh becoming image, which is in a way the word becoming flesh and the flesh becoming word, in this active reciprocal anacarnation. This is really important if there is to be a healing of our planet and of our world and indeed of ourselves. We need the image and we need the flesh. We need sight and we need touch. So I think the movement from the Anthropocene, which began with Plato and goes down really to Descartes, Kant, German idealism, I'm talking philosophy here, of course, into the 20th century, comes into a certain crisis, critical crisis, with phenomenology, that returns to and restores the fundamental insight, initial insight of Aristotle, which became somewhat occluded subsequently in Western metaphysics, which was an Anthropocene, and it recovers it in a way that opens the doors to a new Symbiocene of reciprocal, recursive, mutual relations with others.